Okay, Mikayla, I've got your work and I've got your post here. So I just kind of wanted to address your writing. I just want to move that over just so all right, there we go. Okay, so I found space and letters, uh, space and spacing. And I think you're referring to placement of your design elements when you say space and spacing. Um, uh, but clarify that if I've got that wrong. I'm not real sure if you mean like the space between elements or the space between the margins and the elements, but I think you're talking about general layout. So we'll talk about that definitely. And in case you're talking about your general spacing in terms of placement, we'll talk about that too. So I just want to cover all bases here. Um, Rearranging elements, my original design to give everything its space to make it feel cluttered. Yes, that makes sense. I think the only thing, big issue that's really bothering me is the spacing on the dots for my timeline. I know that they're unevenly spaced, and that's okay. But I'll talk about that in 1 second. And matter of fact, let's address that right now. Let's talk about the timeline right now. Then we'll go back and we'll talk about your typography, your composition for the front and the back of the piece, and then I'll go ahead and make some recommendations for improvement. We'll look at both layout and typography. So here we are. I've got the back of the poster, and then my camera's in the way, so we'll just kind of move that a little. All right, we're looking good here. Okay, so the first thing you wanted to talk about was, or the first thing I wanted to talk about was your comments on the timeline not being evenly spaced. That's okay. The timeline is designed, and the timeline is a visual representation of the events um, chronologically as they occur. So when you design a timeline, quite often you want to space the intervals um, differently, and the distance of those intervals is based on the amount of time between the events. Do you see what I'm saying? So, okay, so let's say she was born in, let me just increase that a little bit. Born in 1997. Okay, so she's born in 1997, and let's say she didn't, nothing else happened until 2019. Then there would be 1997. Then there would be a large gap between the 1997 and the 2019, indicating that nothing really happened between those years. Did you see what I'm saying? But if you had something happen every year, the gaps would be smaller, indicating that time lapse. I hope that makes sense. So right now, I think so. So you have 1997, 2007, 2009, 11, 12, 13, 15, and 19. I think you're good. I think that these are spaced together a little closer as these years. It seems like something happened 1 year after the next. And that's when she was in the news the most, really was in between really 2007 and 2015 or 16 or so. And now she's not quite in the news as much as she is, but does still continue with her fight. So that's great that you added this 2019. Now in the timeline, I'm noticing a couple of inconsistencies. Right now, you've got an indent here at 2014. Looks like you got a little indent at 2013, but the 97, 2007, 2009, none of those have indents. So be sure that you're as consistent as possible there. Also, I see that this 2011 entry right here seems to, um, let me see, some of your entries, it seems like they start, well, how do I put this? I would start each entry at the same spot in relationship to the circle. I would probably start it right where the top of the circle, and that would be the top of the text block for the event. Okay, so then we just come over there and be across, directly across from the top, as opposed to here, you're up a little bit. You see that? And here you're directly across. So watch your spacing there in how you start the year in the timeline and how that year corresponds to its to the circle that is representing that specific year in the timeline. Okay, again, in the timeline, a couple of widows right there, right there. Remember what a widow is? To review, you can go ahead and take a look at our 18 rules, remember. A widow is basically a word that falls on a line alone, typically at the end of a paragraph. So we don't want widows. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the general composition itself. I think there's one thing here that's a little bit odd, and that's that you've got two columns of type, and you've got the image above both columns, right? But it doesn't appear that the image is centered on those two columns. It's over just by a couple pixels. Presumably, you pushed it over to make room for biography. But that creates a little bit of inconsistency here. So this should probably be centered right on the center of that gutter. It's only, it looks like it's a few pixels off, but nonetheless, it may entail you having to make a different decision here in biography. Personally, I think this is really text heavy. I would recommend that you edit this and maybe try to think about reducing the amount of body copy associated with the two paragraphs in the biography. I think it's really, really text heavy, which is okay. I think your typesetting is good. But one thing I would recommend with the black type on the green background, it is a sans serif, that was smart, but I would increase the tracking all the way around. I would also increase the leading between the lines just to open up the typographic color, make it a little bit more airy. Right now, I think it's pretty dense, in part due to the fact that it's black type. Also, if you take a look, you want to adjust your rags, definitely. I've got my good rags, bad rags here, and I'll just show you that. I think we've looked at this before together, but this is good rag, bad rag. And for some reason, my computer just crashed. Oh, here we go. Okay, I'm back up and running. Crashed out for a second there. Okay, this is good rag, bad rag, good rag, bad rag. So the rag is the way that the end of the paragraph sits, and that is in a flush left, rag right paragraph. So you don't want your rags to do this. There shouldn't be a big distance between the longest and shortest lines. There also shouldn't be any diagonals or any kind of wavy patterns. You don't want any of that. You just kind of want it to go something like this, like a long line, short line, long line, short line, to the point where you can't even really notice. What we're trying to avoid is this kind of diagonal right here. See this? Where it just kind of juts in like that. Here's another one right here. Here's a great example. You don't want this. Watch my cursor. Goes in, then out. You want long, short, long, short, long, short. This looks pretty good. Although that's long, long. Yeah, it definitely needs to be adjusted. So you definitely want to go long, short, long, short, long, short. Without any patterns or any kind of wavy patterns. A wavy pattern would be something like this. This right here, where it goes whoop like that. You see. So we don't want any diagonals or any wavy patterns. Okay. Let's take a closer look at our typography. Good job, old style. Nice job technically. That hyphen right there should be an N dash. N as in Nancy, since it is indicating a number right there. This last line looks like it's wider spread. I mean, this is kind of odd right here. This years right here, that widow that I talked about earlier. If you look at the line spacing, this line right here is wider. It's further than the other lines. In other words, the leading on this line is greater than the leading on these lines. You definitely want to adjust that. Another widow right there. Again, these should all be N dashes. N is in Nancy. Okay, as far as typography in your main copy, again, I increase the leading, increase the tracking to lighten up the typographic color. I notice a few areas you're only including one space after the period. I'm sorry, you're not including a space after a period. There's always only one space after a period, never two, but at least one. There's an example right there. There's no space after that period. There's an example right there, no space after that period either. Okay, other than that, okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the front cover. And I think the front cover, I think that in the front cover, I would recommend that, I'm sorry, I can't miss the front cover, the front of the poster. I would watch your kerning here. These got really wide spaces. All of these can be reduced, especially that. These can all be closed down a little bit. And this is really kerned really oddly. There's a huge space between this Y and the O, and another huge space between the O and the U. And then there's a pretty big space between the U and the S. Then we get a little bit smaller, a little smaller. That's really tight there. That's pretty tight. So we definitely want to pay attention to kerning. This is set pretty well, but I'm not crazy about the way this just sits in the center of the composition. I think you really have a nice chance here to provide some visual engagement, some interaction between the headline and the subhead, as well as an interaction between the figure and ground elements in terms of positive and negative space. So definitely want to think about that. Okay, so those are my recommendations. Sorry, 11 minutes. Didn't mean to do that, but I did want to be as thorough as possible. So let's go ahead and shoot for those changes for your second submission. Oh, here's another space after a comma too. Okay, so yeah, go ahead and make those changes for Sunday submission. If you have any questions at all, yes, please let me know. I'll be glad to clarify any of my comments. Okay, thank you very much.